The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a universe of soft light and money. It was the kind of light that didn't come from bulbs, but seemed to be woven from the crystals of the chandeliers themselves, spilling over everything and making the silverware glow. The air hummed, not with noise, but with a low, comfortable murmur, the sound of important people being important together. It was a charity gala for the city's symphony, and every tuxedo and gown in the room cost more than most people make in a month. In this universe, she was a satellite, a silent, moving speck in a black dress and a stark white apron. Her name was Elena, and tonight she was a pair of hands holding a tray. She moved through the forest of silk and fine wool with a kind of weary grace, her eyes down, a polite, empty smile fixed on her lips. Her tray carried flutes of champagne that bubbled like liquid gold. She offered them to extended hands that never looked at her face. A thank you sometimes came, directed at the air beside her. She was part of the scenery, as functional and invisible as the velvet curtain beside the stage, that stage. She couldn't stop looking at it. Not at the people on it, a string quartet playing something pleasant and forgettable, but at the object that dominated it, sitting there like a sleeping king. A Bissendorfer grand piano. Its lid was propped open, revealing the beautiful, terrifying geometry of the strings inside. The polished black wood shone like a deep, still lake under the lights. Every time she passed near it, a weird feeling twisted in her stomach. Not hunger from skipping dinner to work, but a deep, physical longing. Her fingers, curled around the stem of a champagne flute, would twitch. They remembered. The cool, smooth touch of ivory. The specific weight a key needed to make a sound whisper or sing out. The gentle ridge where the black keys met the white dot. It had been over a year since she'd touched a proper piano. The thought was a small, private bruise she carried with her. Back home, in her city in Ukraine, her whole life had been measured in scales and arpeggios, in the minutes before a lesson and the hours of practice after. Her room was small, but it had a decent upright piano that her teacher had helped her family find. That piano was where she laughed, cried, and shouted in frustration. It was where she felt most like herself. Then the world exploded. Not metaphorically. The sirens, the frantic packing, the goodbye to her father who had to stay, the terrifying journey west with her mother and younger brother. The piano, along with everything else that was normal, was left behind in an apartment that might not even be standing now. Here in Vienna, music was a ghost. It haunted the practice rooms of the grand conservatory she walked past every day, a place she could no longer afford to attend. It lived in the posters for concerts she didn't have money for. It echoed in the elegant pieces the string quartet was playing, pieces she had practiced herself. Once. Now, music was the clink of glasses on her tray. It was the muffled thump of the kitchen doors swinging shut behind her. It was the low instructions from the catering manager, a stern woman with a clipboard. Faster, girl. Don't linger. Top up the glasses on table 7. The bald man with the red tie is a big donor. Be extra quick for him. She was pulled from her thoughts by a sharp voice. You, waitress. A man in a tuxedo that seemed too tight around his neck was holding an empty glass, shaking it slightly so the ice cubes rattled. He didn't look at her. He was talking to his companion, a woman dripping in diamonds. See, this is the problem with these events. You pay a fortune for the ticket, and the service is glacial. Elena felt her cheeks grow hot. She quickly swapped his empty glass for a full one from her tray. My apologies, sir, she murmured, the English words feeling thick and foreign on her tongue. He finally glanced at her, his eyes sweeping over her uniform with mild distaste before returning to his conversation. As I was saying, the real investment is in the young soloists, not this bureaucratic orchestra nonsense. Elena melted back into the crowd, the heat in her face turning into a cold lump of shame in her throat. This was her life now. This was how she paid for the tiny, damp apartment she shared with her mother and brother. This was how she paid for his medicine, for the cough that wouldn't go away since the long, cold nights in refugee shelters. Her hands, which her old teacher had called gifted, were now used for carrying other people's drinks and wiping their spills. She passed by the piano, again on her way to the kitchen. This time, she allowed herself a full 3-second look. She imagined walking over, setting her heavy tray down on the floor, and just sitting, letting her hands fall onto the keys. What would she play? Maybe that little Bach prelude, the one that was like an intricate musical clock, or the first few bars of the Rachmaninoff her teacher said she was finally ready for. Right before everything ended, a loud, sudden laugh from a nearby group jolted her back. The fantasy popped like a soap bubble. She was being ridiculous. A waitress in a borrowed uniform, dreaming of a concert grand. She tightened her grip on her tray, the edges biting into her palms. Dreams didn't pay the rent. Dreams didn't buy antibiotics. The kitchen was a blast of noise and steam, a jarring contrast to the chilled elegance of the ballroom. The catering manager, Frau Weber, pointed a finger at her. Rostova, the canapes are going out. Take the silver tray, the one with the salmon. And for heaven's sake, stand up straight. You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders. Elena nodded, forcing her spine straight. She swapped her drink tray for the heavier, hotter one of food. As she pushed back through the swinging doors, she caught a snippet of conversation from 2 older guests standing by the entrance. Heard Maestro Gerhardt is playing the Appassionata tonight, one said. Voice full of reverence. A rare treat, the other replied. He's been unwell, you know, but he insisted for the charity. That man is a true artist. Elena's heart gave a little thud. The Appassionata, Beethoven's Sonata, No. 23. It was a volcano of a piece, full of fire and storm and sudden, tender calm. She had a worn recording of it on her phone, a relic from her old life. She used to fall asleep listening to it, the dramatic chords echoing in her dreams. Now, she would serve tiny pieces of salmon on toast to people who would listen to that same music in real life, performed by a master. The divide between her and that world felt wider than the ocean she had crossed. She was on the side of serving, not creating. Of cleaning up, not performing. The evening wore on. Her feet began to ache in a deep, throbbing way. The polite smile on her face felt carved from wood. She cleared empty plates, their surfaces smeared with fancy sauces and forgotten crumbs. She became a machine. See empty glass, fill empty glass. See dirty plate, remove dirty plate. But her eyes, against her will, kept being pulled to the stage. The Bissendorfer waited. It was just an object, she told herself. Wood, wire, and felt. But to her, it looked like a doorway. A doorway back to the person she used to be, locked tight and guarded by a world of black ties and ball gowns. She didn't know it then. But the key to that door was in her own 2 tired hands, and the night was about to hand it to her in the most unexpected, terrifying way. For now, she was just Elena, the waitress, counting down the minutes until she could take off these painful shoes, collect her pay, and go home to her silent, musicless apartment. The grand piano was for the maestro, and the maestro would be here soon. Her only job was to stay invisible until then. The clock was ticking down. You could feel a shift in the ballroom, a gathering of attention. The string quartet had finished their last polite piece and packed away their instruments. The gentle background murmur of the crowd grew a little louder, a little more expectant. People were finishing their final glasses of wine, their conversations turning more and more to the main event. Elena felt it too, a nervous energy that wasn't her own. She was collecting a small forest of empty wine glasses from a table near the back when she saw him. The maestro Dot he had entered from a side door, a small, elegant man with a shock of white hair. He was accompanied by the event organizer, a flushed man in a tuxedo who was talking at him very fast and with many hand gestures. The maestro looked pale, not just fair-skinned, but unwell. He nodded slowly at whatever was being said, but his posture was stiff, and he pressed a hand briefly, almost secretly, against his stomach. He was guided to a plush chair in the corner of the stage, away from the main lights, and a glass of water was brought to him. He took a small sip and closed his eyes. Elena paused, a glass in each hand. She'd seen that look before, on her brother, during the worst of his fever last winter. It was the look of someone trying very hard to simply exist through a wave of nausea. A small knot of worry formed in her own stomach, but she shook it away. It was not her business. The man was a legend, probably just tired or nervous. He would walk to the piano, and the magic would happen. She went back to the kitchen with her load of glassware. The next 20 minutes were a blur of final cleanup before the performance. The other waitstaff buzzed around, clearing the last dessert plates, making sure every surface was spotless for the audience's full attention. Frau Weber was everywhere, her voice a sharp whisper. Quietly, quickly. The maestro performs in 15 minutes. I want this room pristine. Elena was scrubbing a tiny spot of chocolate sauce off the pristine white tablecloth when she felt the change. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a sudden stillness, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, a commotion near the stage. She looked up. The event organizer was no longer flushed. He was ashen. He was crouched by the maestro's chair, his hand on the older man's shoulder. The maestro was bent forward, his face a mask of agony, one hand clutched to his middle. 2 hotel staff members rushed over. Words, sharp and panicked, cut through the new silence. Call an ambulance now. Could it be his heart? No, he says it's his stomach, terrible pain. The crowd's polite murmur had died. Now it was a rising wave of confused whispers. People were leaning in, standing up to see. The elegant event was cracking apart. Elena stood frozen, the cleaning cloth dangling from her hand. She watched as the maestro, supported by 2 men, was helped to his feet. He tried to wave them off, to stand straight, but another cramp doubled him over. They half walked, half carried him towards the same side door he had entered from. He was leaving. He was definitely not playing the piano. The event organizer stumbled to the center of the stage, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. He tapped the microphone. The sound was a loud, painful thump that made everyone wince. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, he began, his voice trembling. I apologize deeply. Maestro Gerhardt has been taken suddenly and severely ill. The medical services are on their way. It appears to be a case of acute food poisoning. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by hundreds of hands instinctively looking at their own stomachs. The organizer wiped his brow. For his safety, and obviously he is in no condition to perform. The performance, the Beethoven, is, with our deepest, most profound apologies, cancelled. The silence that followed was total. Then it shattered. It wasn't angry, not yet. It was a deep, disappointed groan, the sound of a beautiful promise being broken. Then the voices started, rising like wasps. Cancelled? We paid 5,000 euros a seat. This is outrageous. The entire evening is for the performance. Food poisoning? From this hotel? I demand to speak to the manager. The organizer looked like he wanted the stage to swallow him whole. He stammered into the microphone, trying to talk about the charity, about the other parts of the evening, but he was booed gently, politely, but firmly off the stage. Back in the kitchen, chaos had erupted of a different kind. Frau Weber was being yelled at by the hotel's furious manager. "Your kitchen. Your staff. You have poisoned a national treasure and ruined the biggest event of our season." Frau Weber was yelling back, her face crimson. "It was not our kitchen. He ate before he arrived. I have the paperwork." The other waitstaff huddled by the sinks, eyes wide with fear. Their jobs, their pay for tonight, it all hung in the balance. If the event was a total disaster, the catering company might not get paid. They might not get paid. Elena thought of the envelope with her cash wages, thought of her brother's medicine. The cold lump of fear in her throat turned to ice dot. She drifted to the doorway, peering back into the ballroom. It was a scene of unraveling elegance. People were gathering their wraps, their faces set in lines of disgust and frustration. The charity, the cause, it was all forgotten in the face of this spectacular letdown. The grand piano sat on the stage, empty and silent, now a symbol of the evening's failure. A thought, wild and completely insane, flickered in the back of her mind. It was so ridiculous, she almost laughed at herself. But it didn't go away. It sat there, pulsing alongside her panicked out the music. The Appassionata. It wasn't gone. It was in her head. She knew it. Not perfectly, not like a maestro, but she knew the shape of it, the storm and the calm of it. She had practiced it for months, until her teacher had nodded, a rare smile on his face. "You understand the fire in it," he had said. "Now you must learn to control the burn." The organizer stumbled into the kitchen, looking for water, or maybe a place to hide. He was muttering to himself. A disaster. A total, unmitigated disaster. They'll want refunds. The charity will get nothing. My career is over. And something in Elena broke. Not with sadness, but with a sudden, clear surge of defiance. It was the same feeling she'd had when she'd packed her bag to leave her home. A fierce, protective energy. This wasn't just about spoiled rich people. The charity would get nothing. The musicians it helped, people maybe like her old friends from conservatory, would get nothing. And she would go home with nothing, to a sick brother and a mother's worried face. Before she could think, before the fear could clamp her mouth shut, her feet were moving. She walked toward the organizer, her heart hammering so hard she felt it in her ears. The kitchen staff watched. Confused dot, she stopped in front of him. He didn't even see her at first, just a waitress in his way. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice came out as a dry croak. She cleared her throat. He looked at her, his eyes unfocused with panic. "What? What is it?" "Not now." She swallowed. This was it. The point of no return. "Sir," she said, forcing the words out. "I am a pianist. I was a student at the conservatory. In my home country. I know the Appassionata. I could play." For a long moment, he just stared. He looked from her face, to her white apron, to her sensible black shoes, and back to her face. The expression that crossed his was not hope, but a kind of bewildered insult. Was this a joke? "You," he said flatly. "You are a waitress." "Tonight, yes," Elena said, and something in her voice steadied. It was the truth, simple and plain. "But I am a pianist. I can play the sonata. Not like him, but I can play it." He opened his mouth to dismiss her, to shout at her for her insolence. But then his eyes darted past her, into the ballroom where the angry, disappointed crowd was beginning to leave. He had no other options. There was no understudy, no backup plan. It was either let the whole thing collapse into financial and professional ruin, or he looked back at her, really looked. He saw the trembling in her hands, but he also saw the set of her jaw, the desperate, serious light in her eyes. This was not a joke. It was a Hail Mary pass from the most unexpected place imaginable. He let out a breath that was half a sob. "Do you have any idea what will happen if you go out there and make a fool of yourself? Of me? It will be the same as what is happening now," Elena said quietly. "Nothing." A strange, almost hysterical laugh escaped him. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. He was a drowning man, and she was a piece of driftwood. He had no choice but to grab it. "All right," he whispered, the words sounding like a death sentence. "All right, go, go. What is your name?" "Elena." "Elena, go to the piano. For the love of God, just play something." He turned and hurried back towards the stage, looking like a man walking to the gallows. Elena stood still for 1 second. The noise of the kitchen, the yelling, the clattering pans, it all faded to a distant hum. All she could hear was the roaring in her own ears. What had she just done? She turned. The kitchen staff were all staring at her, their mouths open. Frau Weber looked utterly horrified. Elena ignored them. She walked to the corner where she had stashed her small bag. With fumbling fingers, she untied her stiff white apron and let it fall to the floor. It was just a black dress now, simple and plain, but it was no longer a uniform. She stepped out of her flat, comfortable work shoes. In her bag was a single pair of shoes she carried with her always, a relic of her old life, simple black ballet flats. She slipped them on. Then she walked, past the stunned kitchen staff, through the swinging doors, and into the glittering, angry ballroom. She didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on the one thing in the room that felt like home, the silent, waiting Bissendorfer. The walk from the kitchen doors to the stage felt like 100 miles. The air in the ballroom, once warm with conversation, was now cold with disappointment and confusion. It was a thick soup she had to push through. She kept her eyes down, not on the people, but on the geometric patterns of the polished floor, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. A few people near the back noticed her first. A woman in a silver dress, gathering her purse, paused and nudged her husband. "What is that waitress doing?" Her whisper was like a scratch in the quiet. More heads turned. A low, confused murmur started to rise again, replacing the angry grumbles. Elena heard none of it. Her world had shrunk to a tunnel. At the end of it was the piano, the beautiful, terrifying beast. The event organizer, looking like he might be sick himself, was standing by the steps to the stage. He gave her a tiny, desperate nod as she passed him. It was not a vote of confidence. It was the gesture of a man pushing someone out of a plane dot. She reached the 3 shallow steps. Her simple black flats were silent on the wood. She climbed them and was now exposed under the full, unforgiving glare of the crystal chandeliers. The murmur from the crowd grew louder. It was a sound of pure bewilderment. Was this part of the show? Some strange performance art apology? She stopped in front of the piano bench. For a moment, she just stood there, her back to the crowd of a few hundred of Vienna's wealthiest and most annoyed citizens. She looked at the keys. They were so clean, so perfect. They gleamed under the lights like a row of little teeth. This was an instrument for masters, for people who had their names in programs, not for a refugee waitress with shaking hands. She could feel every single eye in the room drilling into her back. Her heart was a wild animal trying to kick its way out of her chest. Her breath came in short, shallow little gasps as she knew the microphone would pick up. This was a mistake. A huge, public, humiliating mistake. She should turn around, bow, and run back to the kitchen. They would laugh, maybe. They would be angry. But it would be over. Then she thought of her teacher. His kind, wrinkled face. He never yelled. When she was nervous before a recital, he would say, "The piano is just wood and wire. You are the music. Go and have a conversation with the wood and wire. Tell it your story." She also thought of the empty medicine box on the counter in her tiny apartment, of her brothers coughing in the night, of the organizer's words, "The charity will get nothing. This wasn't for them." Not for the tuxedos and the gowns. It was for the chance at a wage tonight, for the charity that might help some other kid with a cough and a dream. For herself, just to prove to the silent piano and to her own frightened heart that the girl who used to play was still in there somewhere. She sat down. The bench was firm, higher than she was used to. She adjusted it slightly, a small, practical movement. The rustle of her simple dress was loud in the quiet. She placed her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. She blocked out the light, the people, the terrifying scale of the room. She listened to the echo of her own breathing. She thought of the first notes, the appassionata. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper, a deep, questioning sigh in the lower keys. But her mind was a storm. She couldn't start there. It was too big, too exposed. She needed to find her way to the instrument first, to remember what her own hands could do. Her teacher's voice again, calm in her memory. When you are lost, play the truth. Play the simplest true thing you know. Her hands lifted. They were not elegant in the air. They were the hands that had carried trays and scrubbing pots. They shook. She willed them to stop, and they only shook more. So she let them fall. They didn't go to the dramatic, rumbling beginning of the Beethoven. They went to a different place entirely. Her right hand found a single high note. It was pure, clear, like a drop of water. Then another, a third below. A simple, broken chord. Then her left hand joined, not with the powerful bass of the sonata, but with a soft, rocking pattern, a gentle heartbeat. It was Chopin, the nocturne in C-sharp minor. She hadn't planned it. Her fingers had just gone there on their own, as if seeking comfort. It was one of the first serious pieces she had ever learned to love, a piece full of longing and a sweet, autumnal sadness. The first few phrases were timid. The touch was too light, the pedal clumsy. She was feeling the piano, this magnificent, responsive beast. It was like touching the skin of a stranger. But as the familiar melody unfolded, a memory unlocked. She wasn't in the Ritz-Carlton. She was in her old room, the streetlights casting long shadows through the window, her mother humming along from the kitchen. The notes were not just notes. They were the smell of her home, the feeling of the worn rug under her old practice bench, the safe, tired smile of her father listening from his chair. Her fingers settled. The shaking stopped. The sound grew warmer, fuller. She leaned into the melody, letting it sing. The beautiful tone of the Bissendorfer did the work for her. It took her simple touch and turned it into something golden and heartbreaking. The piece was a lament, a goodbye to something beautiful lost. And she was finally truly saying goodbye. She poured every memory of her lost city, every fear of the journey, every lonely night in a new country into those rising and falling scales. The crowd was utterly silent. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of anger or confusion. It was the silence of being caught off guard, of irritation giving way, slowly, to surprise. This was not what they expected. This was not a joke. The waitress could actually play. And she wasn't just playing notes. She was telling them a story without words. A woman in the front row, who had been checking her watch impatiently, slowly let her hand fall to her lap. She stared, not at Elena's back, but at her hands moving over the keys. The last notes of the nocturne faded away, a question left hanging in the air. There was no applause. The spell was too fragile. Elena didn't move. She stayed in that place, in the memory. But the memory was over. The sadness had been acknowledged. And now, something else stirred Dot. It was the frustration of the last year. The anger at the snide comments, the pain in her feet, the helplessness of watching her mother count every coin. The fire she had been keeping banked, the appassionata fire, began to heat up inside her chest. Her eyes were still closed, but her posture changed. She sat up straighter, her shoulders drawing back. Her hands, now warm and alive, repositioned themselves over the keys. She found the place. That deep, ominous, questioning note. This time, she played it. Dot. It was like throwing a switch. The gentle world of Chopin was gone. In its place was a dark, rumbling storm. The left hand began its relentless, fateful march. The right hand answered with a sharp, striking chord. Da-da-dum. It was recognizable to every classical music lover in the room. This was what they had come for. But this was different. Maestro Gerhardt was known for his precision, his intellectual power. This was raw. This was personal. The storm in the music met the storm inside the young woman at the piano, and they became the same thing. She played the furious passages, not with cool control, but with a desperate strength. The fast runs up and down the keyboard weren't just technical displays. They were escapes, flights from fear. When the music fell into its moments of quiet, terrible beauty, her touch became so tender it was almost painful to hear. It was the memory of a lullaby, a moment of peace before the war. She forgot about the crowd. She forgot about the job. She forgot about everything except the battle with the piano. It was a fight she had to win. For every time she'd been ignored, for every dream she'd been told to put away, for the family she was trying to hold together with her tired hands, she poured it all into the keys. The music swelled, crashed, retreated, and attacked again. Sweat beaded on her forehead. A strand of hair came loose from her simple bun. She didn't notice. She was inside the tornado, and the audience was pulled in with her. They had come to observe greatness, to admire it from a polite distance. They were not prepared to witness it being born, right in front of them, in a burst of struggle and feeling. The man who had complained about slow service earlier sat absolutely still, his mouth slightly open. The woman in diamonds had stopped fiddling with her necklace. No one was leaving. No one was even breathing too loudly. Dot. They were no longer looking at a waitress. They were watching an artist stripped bare, telling them a truth that was deeper than any apology. The simple black dress, the tired posture, the focused intensity, it all made sense now. The music explained her, and it was utterly, breathtakingly amazing. The final, thunderous chords of the first movement crashed through the ballroom like waves against a cliff. The sound didn't just fade. It seemed to hang in the air, vibrating in the crystal and in the chests of everyone listening. Elena's hands fell from the keys, hovering just above them, trembling not from nerves now, but from the sheer physical effort. A single drop of sweat traced a path down her temple. She was breathing hard, as if she had just run a long-distance. Dot. In the silence that followed, you could have heard a pin drop on velvet. It was a complete, stunned silence. No one coughed. No one shifted in their chair. The air felt charged, like after a lightning strike. Elena didn't turn to look at them. She was deep inside the world of the music, and the journey wasn't over. The appassionata had more to say. There was a slow movement coming, a deep, sad song after the storm. She let her breathing steady. She closed her eyes again, shutting out everything but the feeling in her fingertips and the map of the sonata in her mind. Her hands moved, and the first notes of the second movement began. They were simple, stately, a gentle procession of chords. After the fury of what came before, it was like a cool hand on a fevered brow. But this wasn't a simple lullaby. There was a profound sorrow in it, a weight. She played it with a tenderness that felt almost too private to witness. Her touch was so soft, so careful, it was as if she was trying not to wake someone. It was the sound of mourning. Mourning for her home, for the normal life that was stolen, for the easy path her talent was supposed to take. In the audience, an older gentleman, a patron of the arts for 50 years, felt his eyes grow unexpectedly damp. He had heard this piece performed a dozen times by the world's best. He had never felt it like this. He wasn't hearing a performance. He was hearing a confession. He saw, in the curve of her back, in the focused stillness of her head, not a polished star, but a person who had lived the sadness the music was trying to describe. He blinked quickly, embarrassed, but saw the woman beside him dabbing carefully at the corner of her eye with a napkin. The gentle theme built, variations weaving around it, sometimes sweet, sometimes touched with a shadow. Elena guided it, her face a mask of quiet concentration. The struggle was gone, replaced by a deep, flowing certainty. She and the piano were no longer separate. They were having the conversation her teacher had talked about. She asked a question with a gentle run of notes, and the Bissendorfer answered with its rich, resonant voice. Then, without warning, the third movement exploded. It was a whirlwind, a furious chase. Her hands became a blur. The music was relentless, a torrent of notes that raced up and down the keyboard with wild, joyful energy. This was no longer sorrow. This was defiance. This was the fight back. This was every ounce of her will, every bit of strength she had gathered from surviving, from working, from hoping when it was stupid to hope. She leaned into the piano, her body moving with the rhythm. The loose strand of hair danced. Her feet worked the pedals with precise, forceful jabs. The technical difficulty was immense, but she wasn't thinking about technique anymore. She was riding the wave of the music, letting it carry her. The passages that were supposed to be clean and precise were instead fiery and bold. A purist might have frowned at a missed note here, a rushed phrase there, but no one in that room was a purist in that moment. They were witnesses to something alive, and raw. The man who had complained about the glacial service was now gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles white. He wasn't seeing a waitress. He was seeing a force of nature. The earlier insult he'd tossed out now felt cheap and small in his own mind, shriveled by the magnitude of what was happening on stage. He felt a strange sense of shame, not for her, but for himself. The music raced towards its famous breathless finale. The pace was dizzying. Elena's entire world was the pattern of black and white keys, the physical memory in her muscles, fighting to keep up with the vision in her soul. She was pushing herself to the absolute limit, to the edge of what she knew she could do. The final pages were a cascade of sound, a triumphant, raging conclusion. With one last, powerful, coordinated motion of both arms, she struck the final. Conclusive chords. Boom, boom, boom. The sound echoed, shaking the floor. And then, true silence. Elena's hands collapsed into her lap. Her head bowed forward, her shoulders rising and falling with deep, ragged breaths. She was spent, completely empty. There was nothing left in her. She had poured out every secret, every memory, every hope onto the keys of a stranger's piano. She felt dizzy, lightheaded. She didn't know if it had been good or terrible. She only knew it was true. For a long, terrible second, nothing happened. The silence was a physical pressure. Then, from the very back of the room, one person stood up. It was the older gentleman with the damp eyes. He didn't clap at first. He simply rose to his feet, his movements slow and full of respect. The sound of his chair scraping back was incredibly loud. A few rows ahead, the woman in the diamond necklace stood up next, then another. And another got. It wasn't a roaring, immediate ovation. It was a wave that built from silence, person by person, as each individual came back to themselves, back to the glittering ballroom, and understood what they had just experienced. They rose, not out of politeness, but because sitting down didn't feel right. It felt insufficient. The sound started. Not wild cheering, but deep, thunderous, heartfelt applause. It was the kind of applause that usually only greets a world-famous maestro at the end of a beloved symphony. It was sustained. It was powerful. It filled the room, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling. A roaring waterfall of sound out. Elena finally heard it. It broke through the fog of her exhaustion. Slowly, like someone waking from a deep dream, she turned on the bench to face the room. The sight made her breath catch. Everyone was standing. Every single person. Their faces were not the bored, irritated masks from before. They were alight with amazement, with gratitude. Some were still crying. Others were smiling, shaking their heads in disbelief. They were looking at her, really seeing her. A shy, completely bewildered smile touched her lips. It was hesitant, unsure of what to do with this storm of approval. She wasn't sure how to be the person they were applauding. She had just been Elena, talking to the piano dot. She did the only thing that felt natural. She stood up, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. She took one small, awkward step forward and gave a little bow from the waist, her hands clasped tightly in front of her simple black dress. It was not the graceful, practiced bow of a concert pianist. It was the bow of someone saying, quietly, "Thank you for listening." This made the applause swell even louder. Whistles cut through the clapping. Shouts of brava rang out, the traditional cry for a female performer. The event organizer was now at the side of the stage, but he wasn't looking at the crowd. He was staring at Elena, his face pale with shock, but now it was the shock of a miracle. He was clapping too, slowly at first, then with growing, frantic joy. He hadn't been ruined. He had been saved. By the waitress. Elena's gaze swept over the standing, applauding crowd. The reality began to sink in, a warm, terrifying, wonderful feeling flooding her veins, mixing with the exhaustion. She had done it. She had actually done it. The fear, the risk, it had all been real. And this was the other side of it. This wasn't the end of a story. She knew that, even in her dazed state. This was a door, suddenly blasted open by a hurricane of music. She had no idea what was on the other side. But as she stood there, in her ballet flats, with the elite of Vienna on their feet for her, she knew one thing for certain. Her life as just the invisible girl with the tray was over. Whatever came next, it had already begun. The applause washed over her like a warm tide, so loud it was almost a physical pressure. Elena stood there, swaying slightly from the leftover energy and the shock, her small bow held as the noise continued. It didn't seem to want to stop. The standing crowd, the shining eyes, the shouts of brava. It was all too much to understand. Her mind was a blank, buzzing static. Finally, the event organizer, the man whose career she had just saved, scurried onto the stage. He was beaming, a transformed person from the panicked ghost of an hour ago. He gently touched her elbow, guiding her off the stage and back towards the kitchen doors. The applause followed them, beginning to mix with excited chatter. The ballroom, once cold with disappointment, was now hot with the energy of a shared, unexpected wonder. Back in the kitchen, it was a different world. The chaos of anger was gone, replaced by a stunned, giddy silence. The other waitstaff were lined up, their eyes huge. Frau Weber, the stern manager, stood at the front. As Elena walked in, still looking dazed, Frau Weber did something extraordinary. She started to clap. A slow, deliberate, respectful clap. Then the others joined in, a quieter, more intimate echo of the roar outside. One of the young dishwashers, A guy about her age let out a low whistle and grinned. Elena felt her face flush with heat. This was almost more overwhelming than the crowd. I'm sorry about the apron," she stammered, looking at where the white cloth lay in a heap on the floor. Frau Weber waved a hand, a gesture that dismissed 1,000 previous rules. "Forget the apron," she said, her voice strangely thick. "What you did out there, that was—" She seemed to search for a word that fit a kitchen and a concert hall at the same time. "That was first class." The organizer was buzzing around her. "You must sit. You must have water. What is your full name? Where did you study? The guests, they are asking. Everyone is asking." But before Elena could even process a question, the kitchen doors swung open. A few of the guests had slipped away from the main crowd, led by the older gentleman who had been the first to stand. He approached her, his expression kind and serious. "My dear," he said, his voice cultured and soft, "that was not a performance. That was a gift. I have heard that sonata my whole life. I have never heard it lived before." He took a crisp white card from his breast pocket and handed it to her. "My name is on this. I am on the board of the conservatory. You will call my office tomorrow. We must talk." Another woman, the one with the diamond necklace, pressed forward. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "How long have you been working here?" she asked directly. "A few months," Helena managed to say. "Since I arrived." "Arrived from where?" "Ukraine." The woman nodded once, as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. She reached into her small beaded purse and pulled out not a card, but a plain checkbook. Right there on the stainless steel counter next to a tray of dirty glasses, she wrote with a quick, decisive hand. She tore off the check and handed it to Elena. "For your brother's medicine," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The amount written made Elena's vision blur. It was more than she made in 6 months. She tried to stammer thanks, but the woman had already turned to the organizer. "See that she gets home safely. In a car. Not on the tram." The next hour was a blur of similar moments. People offered cards, asked gentle questions, pressed cash folded into handshakes. "For your incredible talent." They spoke to her not as staff, but as a discovered artist. The story had spread like wildfire. The refugee waitress, the substitute performance, the stunning talent hidden in plain sight. It was a fairy tale the wealthy guests were thrilled to be part of. Finally, the organizer ushered her out a side entrance, away from the lingering crowd. A sleek hotel car was waiting. "Your wages," he said, pressing a thick envelope into her hand along with a smaller one. "And a bonus from the committee for saving the evening and probably the charity's funding." He shook his head, still amazed. "Go, rest. We will be in touch." The ride home was surreal. Elena sat in the soft leather seat, watching the elegant streets of Vienna's center give way to the quieter, plainer buildings of her neighborhood. She clutched the envelopes, the check, and the business card in her hand, feeling the edges bite into her palm. It was all real. She pushed open the door to her apartment. It was dark and quiet. A single light was on in the kitchen. Her mother was sitting at the small table, mending a shirt, waiting up for her as always. "You are late," her mother said softly, looking up. Then she saw Elena's face, the flushed cheeks, the wide, shell-shocked eyes, the way she just stood inside the door. "What is it? What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" Worry lines deepened on her forehead. Elena walked over and placed the stack of envelopes, the check, and the card on the scratch table. She couldn't speak. She just pointed. Her mother picked up the check first. She squinted at it, her lips moving as she read the number. She went very still. She looked at Elena, then back at the check, as if checking for a trick. This is a mistake. This is too many zeros. It's not a mistake, Elena whispered, her voice finally finding itself. I played the piano. She told the story in a rushed, tangled whisper. The sick maestro, the panic, the impossible walk to the stage, the Chopin that came out first, then the storm of Beethoven. The standing people, the applause that wouldn't end. The cards, the money, the man from the conservatory. As she spoke, her mother's hands came up to cover her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a pressure releasing, a hope so long buried it was painful to see the light. She listened, never interrupting, her gaze fixed on her daughter's face, as if seeing her for the first time in a year. When Elena finished, they just sat in the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The evidence of a changed world sat between them on the mending table. Your hands, her mother finally said, her voice rough. You played with these hands. She reached out and took Elena's hands in her own, turning them over. They were the same hands that had washed dishes and carried trays. But now they were something else too. The next morning, the world outside their apartment had changed as well. Elena's brother, his eyes bright with curiosity, shoved a phone in her face while she was making tea. Look, it's you. On the screen was a shaky, clearly phone-recorded video. It was her. From last night. The angle was from the crowd, showing her back in the simple black dress, her hands moving over the piano in the furious finale of the Appassionata. The video had been posted on a popular social media site. The caption read, Waitress saves Vienna Gala after Maestro falls ill. Prepare to have your jaw drop. It already had thousands of views, hundreds of shares and comments. Who is she? This is the most raw musical talent I've ever heard. A star is born in a hotel ballroom. The phone started to ring. It was a number she didn't know. Hesitantly, she answered, Elena Rostova? A professional, friendly voice asked. This is the producer for the morning news program on ORF. We saw the video. We would be honored if you could come to the studio this afternoon to tell your story and perhaps play a little. She held the phone, looking at her mother and brother. Their faces were mirrors of her own shock. This was moving faster than she could think. She remembered the business card. The one from the older gentleman, the board number. That felt like the anchor in the storm. Not the flash of news, but the solid world of music. She ended the call politely, saying she would think about it. Then she dialed the number on the card. A secretary answered. Before Elena could even give her name, the secretary said, Oh, Miss Rostova, we've been expecting your call. He's in a meeting, but has asked to be interrupted the moment you phoned. Can you hold? As she waited, listening to the soft classical hold music, Elena looked around her small kitchen. At the check on the table that would buy medicine and pay rent for a long time. At her brother's excited face. At her mother, who was watching her with a quiet, steady pride. The video online was just noise. The news was just a bright, quick light. This was a door. A real one. Not blasted open by a hurricane this time, but unlocked by a man who knew music, who had heard her truth in the middle of a broken evening. A click came on the line. A kind, familiar voice said, Elena, it's good to hear from you. I was hoping we could meet today. To talk about your future. Her future. The words sounded strange and beautiful. For so long, her future had been the next shift, the next week's rent. Now it was a conversation. Now it had a piano in it. She took a deep breath. Yes, she said. I would like that very much.